Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. We're continuing our exploration of Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. In episode 14, we shift our focus to the environmental side of crime with a deep dive into environmental criminology. Up to this point, we've spent quite a lot of time, thinking about the criminal actor themselves, their psychology, their social background, the forces shaping them. Today, we're really turning the lens outwards. We're asking how the physical and social setting, the actual environment around us, influences where and when crime happens. It's less about the who or the why, I suppose, in terms of motivation, and much, much more about the where and when of the criminal event itself.
That's a really good way to frame it, yeah. We are indeed diving deep into Roger Hopkins Burke's text, specifically his chapter on environmental criminology. And it really highlights this pivotal shift in focus. I mean, while theories that explicitly call themselves environmental criminology maybe gained traction later, in the 20th century, the core intuition that geography and place matter significantly in understanding crime, well, that's something that's been around for much longer.
Right, it's not a brand new thought, necessarily.
Not at all. So our mission in this deep dive is really to trace that historical thread, see how it evolved from, maybe early, simpler observations to these complex contemporary theories, and then crucially understand how these ideas translate into practical applications for crime prevention in the real world. Things like mapping crime hotspots or using urban design to maybe reduce opportunities for offending.
Okay, so let's try and anchor ourselves with a clear definition first. When we talk about environmental criminology today, what exactly are we talking about? How do key figures like Brantingham and Brantingham define this field for us?
Right. The Brantinghams, Paul and Patricia, a husband and wife team, they were really instrumental in sort of solidifying environmental criminology as a distinct area of study. Back in 1981, they put forward a definition that, well, it remains pretty foundational. They argue that any criminal event, any single instance of a crime happening, involves the convergence of four essential dimensions.
Okay, 4 dimensions.
Okay. You need a specific law that's being violated. You need an offender who's violating that law. You need a target for the crime, and that could be a person, property, even information these days. And critically, you need a specific place where all of this converges in time.
The place. That's the key environmental part.
Exactly. Environmental criminology, they contend, is fundamentally the study of that fourth dimension, the place. It's the scientific examination of where and when crimes occur, with an intense focus on the physical, geographic, and spatial setting of the criminal incident. It's really about understanding the environment of the crime, not just, the environment causing the criminal in the first place.
That makes it very concrete. Yeah, it's like analyzing the crime scene itself, not just digging into the criminal's backstory. So you mentioned this idea isn't entirely new. Let's step back in time a bit. Where do we see the first, maybe, inklings of this environmental thinking about crime?
We can actually trace the roots back surprisingly far, well into the 19th century, particularly in France. You had statisticians like André Michel Guerrier in 1833 and Adolphe Quetelet around 1842. Now, they weren't, what we'd call criminologists today.
The field didn't really exist like that then.
Exactly. But they were pioneers in using quantitative data to study social phenomena. They analyzed official crime data, mostly conviction rates, across different geographical departments like counties, I suppose, in France. And their findings, using what was really cutting-edge data analysis for the time, revealed some fundamental environmental patterns.
Interesting. What did these early statistical maps actually show them?
Well, they showed very clearly that crime rates were not, uniformly distributed across the country. They varied, often greatly, depending on the geographical area. This was a pretty significant empirical finding back then. Crime wasn't just some national average. It had distinct regional patterns.
Okay, so location matter.
Definitely. And furthermore, when they started looking at different categories of crime, say violent crimes versus property crimes, they discovered that the spatial patterns were different. So areas high in property crime weren't necessarily high in violent crime, and vice versa. But what was perhaps most striking, and really hinted at this idea of predictability, was the finding that these geographical patterns of crime were remarkably stable over time.
Stable. How so?
Well, the departments that had high property crime in one period tended to be the same departments with high property crime years later.
Wow. That stability feels incredibly important, doesn't it? It suggests there's something about the place itself, something persistent that fosters or maybe allows certain types of crime? It's not just random or purely down to individuals just passing through.
Absolutely. That consistency across time strongly suggested that the environment, the local conditions, played a significant role.
Hmm.
And this wasn't just a French thing either. Similar observations were being made over in England. Researchers like Joseph Plint in 1851 and Henry Mayhew, in studies drawing on his observations from the 1860s, they confirmed these findings. They found significant variations in crime rates, not just between counties, but even between different towns and villages.
Mayhew's work is particularly evocative, I think, especially his descriptions of London's rookeries. Can you maybe paint a picture of what those were and what he learned from studying them?
Yeah, Mayhew's work is fascinating. In his extensive documentation of London life, he identified these areas he called rookeries. These were typically, dense, often quite dilapidated urban neighborhoods, and they were characterized by a very high concentration of residents who were either actively involved in criminal activities or derive their livelihoods directly from crime, living off theft, fencing stolen goods, that sort of thing.
So crime was almost the local industry.
In some ways, yes, and Mayhew's crucial observation, which was later supported by more formal studies looking back at historical data, was that the high levels of criminal activity in these specific rookery areas weren't temporary. They weren't just a blip. They persisted year after year, decade after decade.
So these weren't just places where criminals happened to live. They were areas where a criminal lifestyle seemed kind of embedded and sustained over generations, maybe.
Exactly. The persistence of these crime levels in specific places like the rookeries was a really powerful empirical finding. It suggested a predictability in where crime would occur. And that implies, that if we could understand why crime clustered there and stayed there, perhaps we could do something about it. This is really the early glimmer of applying environmental understanding to prevention.
Right.
And the source material also draws a line, connecting this back to the Chicago School of Sociology, which we discussed back in Chapter 7.
Ah, yes, Shaw and McKay's concentric zones model. How does their focus on social disorganization in specific urban areas tie into this environmental thread we're following?
Well, the Chicago School sociologists, particularly Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, with their work from the 1930s onwards, they were really focused on understanding why crime and delinquency were concentrated in certain areas of the city, specifically those zones of transition near the central business district. Their main explanation was social disorganization.
Which was about the breakdown of community controls.
Right. The breakdown of community institutions and social controls in these rapidly changing areas, driven by things like high population turnover, poverty, ethnic heterogeneity. But their analysis definitely had a strong environmental component. They argued that crime and delinquency were, in a sense, transmitted through contact. Children and young people growing up in these disorganized areas were exposed to and learned from existing criminal traditions that had become embedded and, importantly, persisted in those specific spatial locations.
So the place itself was kind of like the medium for passing on criminal behavior.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm.
So while their theory was fundamentally sociological, focusing on social disorganization, the idea that this pathology and the associated criminal culture were geographically concentrated in certain places gave it an early, albeit maybe distinct, North American environmental dimension. The environment wasn't just a backdrop. It was seen as a medium through which criminal behavior and traditions were passed on.
Okay, so we see this early recognition that crime isn't evenly spread, that it clusters in specific places and seems to stick around there. Now, moving forward into post-World War II Britain, the source says there was a conscious effort to understand high crime rates in urban working-class areas. What made the British approach during this period stand out?
Yeah, the British ecological studies of the 1950s and 60s by researchers like Mays, Morris, and Wooten, they really tried to grapple with the complex reality of high crime in these urban areas. What was distinctive, I think, was their ambitious attempt to move beyond a single disciplinary lens. They consciously tried to weave together three different sociological perspectives into their environmental analysis.
Three perspectives. Interesting. What were they trying to combine?
Okay, so firstly, they incorporated an ecological approach. They drew on the Chicago School's insights, but adapted them to the British context. They looked at why people lived where they did, considering factors like the competitive struggle for space in urban areas, and, critically, how housing allocation policies by local councils influenced who ended up living where.
Ah, so not just natural forces shaping the city, but also planned social processes like housing policy playing a role.
Exactly. That was a key difference. Secondly, they integrated a deviant subculture approach. This involved looking at how distinctive life patterns, norms, and values that developed within these specific urban environments were linked to the local conditions. How did living in a particular area with its specific economic and social challenges shape the behavior and culture of its residents, sometimes leading to what was seen as deviant behavior.
Okay, so environment shaping culture.
And thirdly, they included the social reaction or labeling approach. This perspective considered the impact of external forces, how societal institutions, particularly the police and maybe the media, classified and labeled certain individuals or groups in these areas as different or bad. The idea was that this labeling could reinforce a sense of marginalization and potentially, contribute to criminal involvement itself.
Right, so a really complex blend of environmental sorting, local culture development, and societal reaction, all shaping crime patterns in these specific places.
Precisely. And theoretically, the source material highlights that while this approach drew on the idea from, say, the predestined actor model that social disorganization in certain areas could cause crime, they also tried to make it more nuanced. They complexified it by introducing the rational actor model's notion of free will. The idea wasn't simple environmental determinism where, the environment just made you commit crime.
Right, trying to add individual agency back into the equation.
Yes, exactly. The theoretical stance was more like, well, while powerful influences like social disorganization, housing inequality, labeling certainly affected group and individual action, ultimately, individuals still had the capacity to choose whether or not to engage in criminal behavior. They could, theoretically, disregard the influences pushing them towards crime. Although, as studies like Rex and Mord showed, for residents in areas like Sparkbrook and Birmingham, their choices about where they lived were severely constrained by that ecological struggle and the competition among different housing classes for desirable accommodation.
That Sparkbrook study sounds like a particularly detailed example of this integrated British approach.
It was, yeah, and is highlighted as a key feature in the source. Rex and Moore's 1967 study in Sparkbrook was really seminal. They applied a modified version of the Chicago school's struggle for space, focusing intensely on the dynamics of housing allocation in a multi-ethnic urban area. Their work put a strong emphasis on the role of the market situation, race relations, and what they actually termed the class struggle for housing in shaping the social and spatial structure of the neighborhood and its associated problems, including crime. What's notable is how explicitly this study broke with the strict ecological determinism sometimes associated with earlier Chicago schoolwork, while still retaining that fundamental insight that differential urban areas, shaped by these social and economic forces, had distinct crime patterns.
Were there other researchers refining this British perspective around that time?
Oh, yes. Leslie Lambert's 1970 study in inner-city Birmingham offered a further theoretical refinement. He challenged some prevailing ideas at the time. For example, he found that the high crime rates weren't primarily attributable to the arrival of new, often unemployed black immigrants, which was a common assumption. Instead, he found that the bulk of the crime was being committed by longer-term, permanent residents, both black and white. Newcomers tended to adapt their activities to fit the existing patterns of the locality, rather than introducing entirely new forms of crime.
So they adapted to the existing environment rather than changing it drastically?
Largely, yes. And again, the explanations for crime were tied back to the structure of the market for jobs, housing, and the leisure opportunities available within those specific areas. The urban disturbances that happened in places like Bristol, Brixton, and Toxteth in 1981 are mentioned in the text as examples of the kinds of social phenomena this type of environmental analysis was trying to illuminate and explain.
And how did this way of thinking evolve further into the 1970s?
Well, by the early 1970s, the theoretical understanding became even more dynamic, I'd say. Researchers like Taylor, Walton, and Young argued in their influential 1973 work, The New Criminology, that delinquency found in high-crime urban areas shouldn't be viewed simply as stemming from individual pathology or, demoralization. Instead, they saw it as reflecting the availability of particular opportunities and gratifications that the urban context presented. Crime was less about inherent badness and more about what the environment made possible or even attractive.
That's a crucial shift in thinking, isn't it? From pathology to opportunity, it really changes the focus of potential intervention.
Absolutely. And concurrently, there was a shift away from maybe static concepts of social disorganization or pathology towards a more dynamic view of local culture, one that acknowledged change, conflict, and struggle within the neighborhood rather than seeing it as some fixed state of being disorganized.
Makes sense, more dynamic.
Yeah, and this led to area studies from the mid-1970s onwards, focusing increasingly on the active manufacture of neighborhood reputation. Researchers like Jeffrey Dahmer in Glasgow and Colin Gill in Sheffield examined how certain areas acquired these stigmatized reputations and how this process itself contributed to crime. Their work looked at the housing area and the smaller neighborhood unit within it, introducing concepts like hierarchies of desirability for different types of housing or different groups of tenants.
Hierarchies of desirability.
Yeah, some areas or types of housing being seen as much less desirable than others. They explored the role of ideology in manufacturing these reputations. Dahmer famously wrote about dreadful enclosures to capture how council housing estates could become labeled and perceived negatively, often regardless of the reality for many residents living there. And crucially, they highlighted how the differential policing of these areas, the way police treated residents or responded to incidents based on the area's reputation, could itself act as a prime agent in producing further offending behavior.
Wow. So the authorities' response wasn't just reacting to crime, but potentially actively contributing to the environment that fostered it. That's a powerful and perhaps uncomfortable idea.
It is. It really layers institutional action onto the environmental influences. However, the source material does point out that despite providing these rich, really detailed descriptions of urban life and the complex interplay of factors in specific locations, these British ecological analyses were sometimes criticized for not providing sufficiently clear causal explanations.
Right, strong on description, maybe weaker on explaining the why.
Kind of. Morris, for example, saw his own work in similar studies more as methods for calculating the likelihood of offending in certain areas, rather than offering a definitive explanation for why crime occurred. Baldwin and Bottoms, in 1976, also critiqued this body of work, saying it was much stronger on vivid description than on rigorous theoretical explanation. And according to Brantingham and Brantingham, it was this perceived weakness in causal explanation within geographical criminology in the UK that partly paved the way, created the intellectual space perhaps, for the later development of a more explicitly theoretical and sophisticated environmental criminology in North America.
Okay, that brings us neatly across the Atlantic then to what Brantingham and Brantingham label contemporary environmental criminology. What were the fundamental changes in perspective that defined this North American shift?
Right. So Brantingham and Brantingham, reflecting on the field in 1981, they identified three main shifts that they saw as propelling the emergence of contemporary environmental criminology from those earlier geographical and ecological studies. First, there was a significant move away from researchers rigidly staying within the boundaries of their own academic disciplines. Environmental criminologists became inherently multidisciplinary. They were willing, even eager, to incorporate techniques, concepts, knowledge from sociology, geography, psychology, urban planning, even economics, to understand the environmental context of crime.
A real cross-pollination of ideas then, breaking down those academic silos.
Exactly. That was crucial. The second shift, and arguably the most significant in defining the modern field, was a conscious decision to move away from the traditional focus of criminology, which was heavily influenced by, the predestined actor model. That traditional focus was on searching for the underlying causes of criminal motivation, trying to understand why someone becomes the kind of person who wants to commit crime.
Okay, so how did contemporary environmental criminology differ?
It takes a different approach. It largely assumes that there is a pool of motivated offenders in society. It doesn't spend a lot of time trying to explain the deep roots of that motivation. Instead, its focus shifts entirely to the actual criminal event itself. The core question becomes, given that motivated offenders exist, where, when, and how do opportunities rise for them to commit crimes? The research focuses on finding patterns in the spatial and temporal distribution of crime, looking at where and when crimes happen, how offenders select targets, and how the environment facilitates or hinders the crime.
So it's not asking why are people criminal, but more like, why does crime happen here now? It's situational.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. And the third shift they identified was an increased emphasis on what they call the geographical imagination, alongside the traditional sociological imagination. Okay, this wasn't about discarding sociological insights, not at all, but about explicitly adding a spatial lens. Using both imaginations together provides a more comprehensive understanding of crime patterns and, importantly, enhances our capacity to control crime by intervening in the environment.
It sounds like really bringing the map into the analysis in a central way, not just looking at social surveys.
Yes, making the spatial element explicit and central. So the core focus of contemporary environmental criminology becomes understanding the spatial patterning of crime across different scales, from individual properties to neighborhoods to entire cities. It examines the journey to crime, the spatial behavior of offenders, and how they find suitable targets. and it investigates how areas that generate or attract crime, or where criminal residents concentrate, are created and maintained. Now, the source material is careful to emphasize this isn't crude environmental determinism.
Right, it's not just the environment made me do it.
No. The process of an offender finding and acting on an opportunity is seen as a multi-stage decision process that takes place within a broader process of environmental learning and evaluation. Offenders aren't just puppets of their environment. They are interacting with it, learning from it, and making decisions, albeit sometimes constrained ones.
That makes sense. It's a dynamic interaction, not a one-way street. And these ideas about opportunities and decisions, they lead us back to some familiar theories we've encountered before in this series, right? Routine activities theory, rational choice theory, and crime pattern theory seem to be the cornerstone concepts here. How do they fit into this environmental framework?
They are absolutely central, yes. Contemporary environmental criminology draws heavily on and often integrates these three perspectives. Let's start with routine activities theory, developed by Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen back in 1979. Its primary purpose was really to explain broad shifts in predatory crime rates, like the increase in residential burglary in the latter half of the 20th century.
Right, and the core of routine activities theory is that famous convergence of three things.
Yes, the classic three elements that must converge in time and space for a predatory crime to occur. You need a motivated offender. And remember, this theory assumes their existence. It doesn't explain their motivation. You need a suitable target, and you need the absence of a capable guardian. And guardianship isn't just, formal security like police or security guards. It includes informal social control neighbors watching out for each other, people simply being present.
That informal part is key.
It is. The power of the theory lies in explaining how changes in our collective routine activities, our daily patterns of work, leisure, home life, can alter the opportunities for crime by affecting the convergence of these three elements. For instance, Cohen and Felsen famously argued that the increase in women's participation in the workforce after World War II meant more homes were left empty during the day.
Reducing capable guardians at home.
Exactly. And creating more suitable, unguarded targets for daytime burglary.
So seemingly unrelated social changes, like more women working, can inadvertently create more crime opportunities just by changing our routines.
Precisely. And changes in the nature of products also play a huge role in target suitability, as Felsen and Clark further detailed later on. Think about electronics. Early televisions were huge, heavy, difficult to move. Modern laptops, tablets, smartphones, flat-screen TVs are small, light, numerous, valuable, and easily portable.
Much more suitable targets for theft.
Much more. So changes in product design and distribution directly impact criminal opportunities.
That makes the connection between our material world and crime very, very clear. Then we have rational choice theory, which focuses more on the offender's decision-making process itself.
Right. Rational choice theory, notably applied to crime by Derek Cornish and Ronald Clark in 1986, shifts the focus specifically to the offender's perspective at the moment of the crime. It posits that offending is not random or senseless. It is purposive behavior designed to benefit the offender. This benefit could be financial gain, excitement, prestige among peers, or satisfying some other need. The core idea is that offenders engage in a kind of cost-benefit analysis, weighing the pros and cons. Yeah, weighing the perceived rewards of the crime against the perceived risks and costs, getting caught, punishment, maybe getting injured.
So they're acting rationally, trying to maximize their gain and minimize their loss, like a little economic calculation.
Yes, that's the basic premise. However, and this is absolutely crucial and really well supported by ethnographic research, talking directly to offenders like the work of Bennett and Wright, Cromwell, Olson and Avery, Feeney, Jacobs, Wright, and Decker. These decisions are often made under conditions of constrained or limited rationality.
Limited rationality, what does that mean exactly?
It means offenders are frequently not operating with perfect information, or ample time for deliberation, or a clear long-term perspective. Their decisions are heavily influenced by immediate circumstances, pressing needs, like needing money for drugs right now, and often altered states due to illicit drug or alcohol use. They might make quick judgments based on limited cues, focusing on immediate rewards over potential future consequences. Their rationality is bounded, bounded by their cognitive abilities, the information available to them in the moment, and their physiological state.
That limited rationality piece feels really key. It explains why offenders might take seemingly obvious risks sometimes, or perhaps miss easy targets other times. And it connects back to the idea of how they find targets, this concept of cues and crime templates you mentioned earlier.
It does, absolutely. Because offenders are operating with limited rationality and often under pressure, they don't typically conduct an exhaustive search for the perfect target. Instead, they rely on learned cues from the environment and mental shortcuts they develop, which are often called crime templates. This idea was central to Brantingham's work from the late 70s and early 80s and has been extensively explored in those ethnographic studies talking to offenders.
Okay, so how does this process of developing and using these templates actually work?
Well, Brantingham outlined a kind of multi-part model for victim or target selection back in '78. Firstly, they see target selection as a multi-stage decision process. An offender searches for a suitable target located in a specific time and space within the environment. Secondly, the specific cues used in these decisions are taken directly from the external environment itself, observable features of places or people. Thirdly, these cues are not innate, they are learned. This learning happens through direct personal experience, trial and error from past crimes, seeing what worked, what didn't, and through social transmission, talking to other offenders, getting tips, maybe learning from mentors.
Learning the ropes, so to speak, pretty much.
Fourthly, based on these learned cues, offenders develop individual cues, clusters of cues, and sequences of cues that they associate with successful past crimes or good targets. These coalesce into these mental crime templates. When scanning the environment, a potential target is evaluated against these existing templates, and if it corresponds strongly to a template for a successful crime, it gets selected. And finally, while an offender might develop different templates for different types of crimes or targets, once these templates are established, they tend to become relatively fixed and strongly influence the offender's future search behavior.
So it's like building up a mental checklist based on past successes or failures. Can you give us some specific research examples of what these cues or templates might look like in practice?
Absolutely. Studies of different types of offenders provide great examples. For instance, research on robbery offenders, like Wright and Decker's work, shows they often look for cues indicating vulnerability in potential victims. Also, an outward appearance suggesting a high potential payoff, like expensive clothing or jewelry. They might prefer locations in specific density areas, and importantly, locations with good escape routes.
Makes sense. Getaway potential is key.
Definitely. For burglars, studies like Cromwell, Olson, and Avery's reveal cues relating to surveillability, how easily they might be seen approaching, entering, or leaving a property. They use occupancy probes, like knocking on the door or checking for lights or cars, to assess if someone is home. They often strongly prefer targets they believe are unoccupied.
Right, avoiding confrontation. That explains why a lot of burglaries happen during the day.
Exactly, that's a key reason. They also look for cues about the difficulty of entry. Weak doors or windows, maybe an accessible backyard like a visible ladder or an open window, as you said. But the research also makes it clear that because of that limited rationality and often immediate needs, offenders often don't wait around for a target that matches all their preferred cues perfectly.
They compromise.
Yeah, they might settle for targets that only meet minimal subjective criteria, as Wright and Decker put it. If they urgently need money for drugs, say, they'll likely take a target that seems good enough based on a few key cues, rather than searching endlessly for the absolute ideal scenario.
That rings true with the idea of constrained rationality. They're making the best decision they can, given their immediate circumstances and limited information processing. This process of searching and selecting within their environment leads directly into crime pattern theory, right?
It does, yeah. Crime pattern theory, also developed primarily by Brantingham, particularly in their 1984 work, builds directly upon these ideas. The central premise is that crime is not randomly distributed across space and time. Not at all. Instead, it results from the complex, non-random interaction of people, both potential offenders and potential victims or targets, and their movements within the urban landscape. Different types of crime, different types of offenders, different types of targets are concentrated in specific areas because the daily lives and movements of people bring them into contact in predictable ways.
So it's about how our ordinary, everyday lives create spatial opportunities for crime to happen.
Precisely. The theory uses three interrelated spatial concepts to explain these patterns, all focused on movement and familiarity. First, activity nodes. These are the locations where people spend the majority of their time, places like home, work, school, entertainment venues, shopping centers, maybe friends' houses. They are the hubs of activity in our daily lives.
The key destinations in our typical week, basically.
Right. Second, pathways. These are the routes people travel regularly between their activity nodes, the streets, sidewalks, bus routes, train lines they use over and over. As people repeatedly travel these paths, The paths themselves and the narrow strips of environment immediately surrounding them become familiar. They become known spaces.
Okay, nodes and pathways. What's the third?
Third, edges. These are boundaries that are conceptually or physically difficult to cross easily. Physical edges are obvious: rivers, forests, major highways, railway lines. Perceptual edges are perhaps more interesting in urban environments. They are boundaries between different types of areas that people hesitate to cross. This could be the boundary between rival gang territories, maybe the boundary perceived by a middle-class resident feeling uncomfortable entering a high-crime inner-city area, or conversely, the boundary perceived by an inner-city offender who avoids targeting affluent suburban areas because they are unfamiliar, they lack anonymity, or maybe the residents there are perceived as more likely to call the police.
So edges are kind of like places where different awareness spaces might meet or clash.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of awareness space, or what sometimes called a cognitive map, comes in. It's the geographical area with which an individual is familiar. It's where they feel comfortable and about which they have intimate knowledge gained through their own daily routine activities, moving between their nodes along their pathways. Crime pattern theory makes a really powerful prediction here. Offenders are most likely to commit crimes within their own awareness space.
Why is that?
Because they are familiar with the layout, they know the typical routines of residents or businesses, they know potential escape routes, and they are generally comfortable operating there because it's part of their known world. Committing crimes outside of this awareness space is perceived as much riskier precisely because of that unfamiliarity.
That's a fascinating idea that many, maybe most crimes aren't random acts far from home, but actually happen within the familiar geography of the offender's own and daily life.
That's a key implication, yeah. And it's strongly supported by Journey to Crime research, which consistently shows that many offenders commit crimes relatively close to where they live or spend significant time. It highlights how the spatial patterns of crime are deeply intertwined with the routine, non-criminal movements and activities of both offenders and potential victims in the urban environment.
So, armed with these theories about how environments structure opportunities and offender decision-making, environmental criminology focuses its attention on specific aspects of crime and place. Where does the research and practical application tend to concentrate?
The field tends to focus heavily on two main areas, primarily. First, there's a strong focus on repeat or chronic offenders. Research consistently shows, as highlighted in studies by Cromwell, Olson and Avery, Horney and Marshall, and Wright and Decker, that a relatively small number of offenders commit a disproportionately large percentage of all crimes. Furthermore, as we discussed with templates, many of these repeat offenders develop preferences for specific types of offenses or targets.
The specialists, if you like.
Kind of. This focus is significant because these are the individuals who are thought to have the most developed and solidified crime templates. Understanding their spatial patterns and the cues they respond to can offer key insights into where and how crime is likely to occur. Targeting law enforcement efforts based on these patterns could, in theory at least, lead to higher detection rates.
It's like finding the predictable patterns in the behavior of the most prolific offenders. Makes sense.
Yeah, focusing on the spatial predictability of their behavior. The second major focus area, and perhaps the most widely recognized application of environmental criminology, is on identifying and analyzing crime hotspots. This concept is based on the very consistent empirical finding that crime is heavily concentrated in relatively few locations. Studies by Sherman, Garton, and Berger, the Brantinghams, and Spellman have shown this phenomenon clearly. Spellman, in a really striking statistic from 1995, noted that the worst 10% of locations reliably account for some 30% of all calls for police service.
Wow. Just 1/10 of locations accounting for nearly a third of all police calls. That's a dramatic concentration.
It really is. It means crime isn't evenly distributed at all. It spikes dramatically in specific microlocations. Brantingham and Brantingham later refined this by distinguishing between crime generators and crime attractors.
Generators and attractors, what's the difference?
Okay, so crime generators are places that draw large numbers of people for legitimate reasons. Think shopping malls, transit stations, large entertainment venues, maybe sports stadiums. The sheer volume of people and activity creates an increased number of opportunities for certain types of crime, like pickpocketing or car break-ins, even if the location wasn't designed for crime or isn't inherently dangerous. Crime attractors, on the other hand, are places that are already known by motivated offenders to offer specific criminal opportunities. Think maybe certain bars around for drug dealing, areas with a high concentration of sex work, or parking lots where cars are frequently left unattended. They deliberately draw offenders seeking to commit crime.
Okay, so generators create opportunities almost by accident because of high volume, while attractors are more like magnets for pre-existing criminal intent.
That's a good way to summarize it. The distinction can be a bit blurred in reality sometimes, but the idea helps understand how different types of locations become high-crime areas. Identifying these hotspots, whether generators or attractors, is incredibly valuable for police departments, especially those with limited resources. It allows them to prioritize where to deploy patrols or target interventions. Directing resources to the areas where a disproportionate amount of crime occurs is a key strategic application of environmental criminology.
It sounds straightforward in theory, find the hotspots, put police there, but I imagine there are complications in practice.
Oh, definitely. There are operational challenges. One issue is just defining the boundaries of a hotspot. As crime analyst Dennis Levine noted, crime density is often continuous. The lines we draw on a map to delineate a hotspot are often somewhat arbitrary perceptual constructs, rather than, naturally occurring breaks in the data.
Where exactly does the hotspot end?
Exactly. Also, the scale of analysis is crucial, as Grant Harries pointed out. What looks like a hotspot on a map of an entire city might just be a small cluster of activity when you zoom into the block level. Or conversely, a hotspot within a single neighborhood might actually be part of a much larger pattern stretching across a wider area.
Right. So, how you define the area you're looking at fundamentally changes what you see. How do researchers and police actually go about identifying these hotspots?
Well, the Crime Mapping Research Center in the U.S. has documented various methods. These range from relatively simple visual inspection of maps with crime incident points plotted on them, to more sophisticated statistical and cartographic techniques. These include things like choropleth mapping coloring areas based on crime rates, grid cell analysis, dividing the map into small squares, and counting incidents. Statistical methods like spatial autocorrelation to see if crime is truly clustered or just looks like it, and various forms of cluster analysis designed specifically to identify groupings of incidents.
So, lots of different mapping tools.
Yes, and the research suggests there's no single best method. The most valuable approach often involves combining that cartographic visualization, actually seeing the patterns on a map, with rigorous statistical analysis to confirm that the clusters are statistically significant and not just random noise. The development of geographical information systems, or GIS, has been incredibly influential here.
GIS, that's the mapping software.
Essentially, yes, GIS software allows analysts to easily map crime data and, crucially, integrate it with other spatial data layers like street networks, building locations, demographic data from the census, the location of businesses like bars or schools. This makes it much easier to identify complex patterns and relationships with far less effort than traditional manual mapping methods.
GIS sounds like the essential tool for modern environmental crime analysis, pulling all these different spatial data layers together to see the bigger picture.
It is absolutely central to contemporary crime analysis, yeah.
Yeah.
It informs much of what we understand about the spatial distribution of crime today.
So we've explored how the environment influences crime patterns and offender behavior. This naturally leads to the idea that if we can understand these environmental factors, perhaps we can change the environment to prevent crime. This brings us to the concepts of environmental design and environmental management.
Exactly. This is where theory meets practice in a very direct and often visible way. Environmental design and environmental management are key applications stemming from environmental criminology and related theories like situational crime prevention. Key figures in this area include people like Jane Jacobs, Oscar Newman, and C. Ray Jeffrey. The core premise is about preventing crime by altering the physical or perceived environment. The goal is to influence the potential offender's decision-making and enhance the ability of legitimate users of the space residents, workers, visitors to control that space and deter crime. A fundamental belief underpinning much of this work is the power of surveillance. The idea that being watched, or even just the potential of being watched, deters criminal activity.
Okay, let's start with Jane Jacobs, who was looking at urban environments back in the mid-20th century. What was her key critique and what did she propose instead?
Jane Jacobs, in her hugely influential 1961 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was a sharp critic of the dominant urban planning trends of her time, particularly those large-scale urban renewal projects that involved demolishing older, often mixed-use neighborhoods and replacing them with modern, often monolithic structures and isolated green spaces. Think big housing projects or separated commercial zones. She argued that these older, seemingly disordered, diverse neighborhoods often had a kind of natural, organic security that modernist planning was actively destroying.
Natural security. How did that work?
While she highlighted features common in these older areas, like buildings being close to the street with porches and windows overlooking the sidewalk. Lots of eyes on the street. These features, she contended, fostered a sense of community, encouraged informal social interaction between residents and shopkeepers, made it easier for people to recognize and identify strangers, and generally increased the sense of security. She believed that demolishing these areas and replacing them with, say, tower blocks set back from the street or isolated parks actually decreased social interaction, made it harder to spot outsiders, and diminished residents' sense of security, inadvertently creating spaces more vulnerable to crime. Her focus was very much on the informal social control generated by the physical layout and the diverse uses of the urban environment.
So, good urban design for Jacobs wasn't about creating sterile, controlled spaces, but rather fostering vibrant, naturally self-policing communities through design.
Precisely. And building on this, Oscar Newman, particularly in his work in the 1970s, also argued that urban crime was partly a symptom of a breakdown in the social mechanisms that enable communities to collectively exert control over their immediate surroundings. He conducted a very well-known study comparing crime rates and patterns in high-rise versus low-rise public housing projects in New York City that serve similar populations.
Ah, yes, the high-rise versus low-rise comparison. What were his key findings in that study?
Newman found significantly higher rates of crime overall in the high-rise buildings compared to the low-rise ones. But crucially, he found that a large proportion of crimes in the high-rises, something like 55%, occurred in the interior public spaces, like hallways, elevators, stairwells, and lobbies. These were spaces that were often anonymous, difficult for residents to see into or monitor from their apartments, and thus very hard for them to claim ownership or control over. In contrast, only about 17% of crimes in the low-rise projects occurred in such interior public spaces. Newman's core conclusion was that the physical design of the high-rises contributed directly to their vulnerability.
The design itself created unsupervised, uncontrolled spaces.
Exactly. His proposed solution was to restructure the residential environment to make it more amenable to resident control and ownership. This is where his seminal concept of defensible space comes in. It's not about creating fortresses necessarily, but designing residential areas in ways that allow residents to become the key agents in ensuring their own security.
Defensible space. And what were the key components or concepts of Newman's defensible space idea?
Newman outlined four main concepts for fostering defensible space. First, territoriality. This involves using design features to create perceived zones of influence or ownership. It's about signaling to outsiders that an area is not truly public but belongs to the residents, encouraging them to adopt proprietary attitudes and control access. Examples might include narrowing entrances to residential areas, using cul-de-sacs, or even just changing the paving material to make a street feel more like a private driveway. Public thoroughfares, or large, undefined open spaces, tend to diminish territoriality.
Okay, establishing a sense of ours.
Right. Second, natural surveillance. This is about arranging buildings and spaces so that residents can easily see and identify strangers or suspicious activity from their homes or as they move around. It involves features like windows overlooking shared courtyards or entrance lobbies that are visible from surrounding apartments. It means avoiding designs, like those long unseen hallways or hidden stairwells in high-rises where offenders can operate without being observed. Eyes on the street again, but maybe more focused within the residential area itself.
Got it. Territoriality, natural surveillance. What else?
Third, creating a safe image. The design of a residential environment should project an image of safety, security, and invulnerability. It should give the impression that this is a place where residents know each other, look out for each other, and where crime is unlikely to be tolerated. Conversely, design that makes a project look neglected, anonymous, or easily accessible can stigmatize it and make it seem more vulnerable. Newman suggested public sector housing was often disadvantaged in this regard due to its appearance and the socioeconomic characteristics often associated with its residents.
Image matters.
It does. And fourth, a safe milieu. This concept suggests that a neighborhood's safety is influenced by the crime levels in the surrounding areas. Ideally, a defensible space would be located within a wider, low-crime area, kind of insulated by a moat of safety. Newman actually debated with Jacobs on this point. He argued that while mixed land uses could generate activity, their contribution to safety depended heavily on whether residents could actually identify with and effectively survey the activity occurring in those adjacent facilities. Just having people around wasn't enough if residents didn't feel connected or able to monitor them.
These concepts seem very logical, very practical on the surface. Did studies evaluating defensible space show clear success in reducing crime when these ideas were implemented?
Well, evaluating the direct impact of defensible space design features has actually proven quite complex and often problematic in research. This is largely because when these concepts are implemented, they are rarely applied in isolation. Usually, multiple design changes are made simultaneously, often alongside other crime prevention initiatives, like increased policing or community programs. This makes it very, very difficult to isolate the specific causal effect of the design features alone.
Too many variables changing at once.
Exactly. For instance, a well-known study in Hartford, Connecticut combined enhanced police patrols, efforts to mobilize citizens, and environmental design improvements based on defensible space ideas. While it initially showed reductions in burglary and robbery, a later follow-up indicated those reductions were unfortunately short-lived. Other studies have found even less conclusive support for the effectiveness of design interventions alone. And there's a crucial point highlighted by Sally Mary's ethnographic research back in 1981. Defensible space design creates the opportunity for residents to control their space, but it doesn't guarantee they will actually do it.
Ah, right. The space must actually be defended by the residents.
Precisely. Residents need to be willing to report suspicious activity, challenge strangers, or intervene in some way. If residents feel apathetic, intimidated, or lack community cohesion, the design features alone, no matter how well thought out, won't prevent crime. The social context is critical.
So design enables, but doesn't guarantee action. That's a vital distinction.
It is. The source material also notes other environmental design features that, while perhaps not strictly defensible space, as Newman defined it, can have a secondary impact on crime. These include things like traffic calming measures, speed bumps, chicanes placing physical barriers, or using one-way street systems. While often aimed at traffic flow or pedestrian safety, these can also deter casual access by potential burglars cruising an area, make quick getaways harder, and contribute to a sense of local ownership and control over the streetscape. The text also notes a kind of renaissance in environmental design efforts by explicitly linking them to routine activity and rational choice theories, focusing specifically on curbing opportunistic crime committed by people as they move between their key daily locations, those nodes and pathways we talked about.
Okay, so environmental design is largely about the physical structure and layout, often considered at the planning stage. What about environmental management? How does that concept differ? It sounds related, but maybe more ongoing.
The distinction is indeed subtle, but important. While environmental design focuses on influencing behavior through the built environment, often at the planning and construction stage, environmental management is more about maintaining the physical environment after it's built to prevent crime and disorder. The premise is that an environment can suffer and become more vulnerable to crime if it gives off signals that suggest no one cares, that informal social control is absent, or that low-level disorder is tolerated. It's more about the upkeep and the signals the state of the environment sends.
And this is where the really influential broken windows thesis comes into play.
Precisely. The broken windows thesis, famously introduced by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling in a 1982 magazine article, is the core theoretical underpinning for environmental management. The central argument is that visible signs of crime, antisocial behavior, or decay, what they termed incivilities if left unaddressed, create an environment that encourages further, potentially more serious, crime and disorder.
Okay, incivilities. What sort of things did they have in mind? What counts as an incivility in this context?
They were talking about things like vandalism, graffiti, litter, public drunkenness, vagrancy, aggressive begging, abandoned buildings, smashed windows, untended public spaces, basically. The everyday signs of neglect and low-level disorder that can make a place feel unsafe or uncared for. Wilson and Kelling painted a very vivid picture of how this could spiral. They suggested if a window in a building is broken and left unrepaired, it signals that no one is watching or cares.
A sign of neglect.
Exactly. This might embolden, say, local children to break more windows. Soon, families might start to move out, fearing the growing disorder. This leaves space for teenagers and perhaps more transient populations to gather. They might start fighting, littering more heavily, or drinking publicly. This, in turn, might attract more serious drunkards and panhandlers. Eventually, the environment deteriorates to the point where more serious criminals feel they can operate with impunity because the area already looks and feels out of control.
It's like a domino effect, where tolerating minor disorder inadvertently invites more serious problems down the line.
That's the core hypothesis. The argument is that the initial incivilities create an environment perceived as lacking control, which encourages further antisocial behavior and crime. And then the evidence of that subsequent crime, more vandalism, more decay, causes further incivilities, reinforcing this negative feedback loop. Environmental management, then, in practice, means proactively intervening to clean up these signs of disorder, quickly repairing broken windows, removing graffiti, cleaning streets, maintaining public spaces, maybe addressing public drunkenness or aggressive begging. The goal is to signal that the community does care and that disorder is not tolerated, thereby preventing that downward spiral and deterring more serious crime. The example often cited is the New York City subway system's effort in the 80s and 90s to clean every train of graffiti every single night.
Really? Every night?
Yeah. The idea was to deprive the graffiti writers of the expressive reward of seeing their work displayed, thereby reducing the incentive for the behavior. And many argue it was effective in that specific context.
The theory sounds compelling, almost intuitive, but was it immediately supported by rigorous research, or was it more of a persuasive idea?
Well, the source material notes that the sheer plausibility of the broken windows theory led to it being quite readily accepted, perhaps despite relatively little robust research support initially. Sociologists like Stephen Matthews, writing in 1992, questioned its widespread adoption. He noted that according to British crime survey data at the time, visible incivilities like drunks, beggars, litter, and vandalism seemed more strongly correlated with residents' fear of crime than with the actual rate of serious crime in the area.
So linked more to perception and fear than necessarily causing more major crime.
That's what some of the data suggested. Matthews also highlighted the significant ambiguity in how these incivilities are perceived by different people. For some residents, particularly maybe older individuals or those from more traditional backgrounds, seeing public drinking, loud groups of teenagers, or visible beggars are genuinely frightening signals of social decay and lack of control. For others, though especially perhaps younger professionals or those with a more cosmopolitan outlook moving into gentrifying inner-city areas, some of these same things, maybe street performers, bustling nightlife, even certain forms of graffiti, might be seen as signs of a vibrant, colorful, and exciting urban environment.
Right. So one person's incivility and sign of decay is another person's urban character or vibrancy. Perception is absolutely everything here.
Exactly. And this raises really complex questions. As Hopkins' book discusses in the text, behaviors like aggressive begging or public urination are clearly antisocial and can genuinely negatively impact public space users, forcing a mother with a pushchair off a sidewalk or creating unsanitary conditions. That's undeniable. Yet the individuals engaging in these behaviors are often among the most marginalized and vulnerable in society, homeless, mentally ill, struggling with addiction. This brings up a difficult dilemma. How do you balance the protection of the wider public from genuinely antisocial behavior with the fact that the justice system's response to these minor offenses can often target and further victimize already disadvantaged individuals? This links into concerns raised by perspectives like left realism, which we'll get to later in the book.
That's a significant ethical and social challenge the theory brings up, maybe even unintentionally. It's not simple.
It isn't simple at all. And the source material presents this ambiguity and the differing perspectives neutrally, acknowledging the complexity without really advocating for one side over the other. But despite the critiques and ambiguities regarding the direct link between incivilities and serious crime rates versus fear of crime, the broken windows thesis has been hugely influential in policing strategies globally. It particularly inspired two major approaches: zero-tolerance policing and the related but distinct problem-oriented policing.
Zero-tolerance policing was a very direct and sometimes controversial application of broken windows, right?
Yes, that's the version that gained significant public and political attention, especially in the U.S. in the 1990s. The idea was for police to proactively and aggressively enforce laws against minor antisocial behavior and quality of life offenses, public drinking, turnstile jumping, minor vandalism. The belief was that cracking down on these small things would send a message and prevent bigger things from happening. However, zero tolerance often proved difficult to sustain long-term due to issues like the potential for discriminatory enforcement against certain groups, negative impacts on police-community relations, and just the sheer resource intensity required.
Right. It could be quite heavy-handed.
It could be perceived that way, yes. A more nuanced and arguably more sustainable approach that emerged, also influenced by the broken windows idea of tackling underlying conditions, is problem-oriented policing, or POP.
How does POP differ from zero tolerance? It sounds less aggressive, maybe.
It's more strategic, I'd say. Problem-oriented policing, championed by Herman Goldstein from the 1970s onwards, and further developed by practitioners like Lee, Reed, and Tilley, represents a fundamental shift from traditional reactive policing. Instead of just responding to individual incidents as they happen call after call after call, POP requires police to analyze the recurring problems they face. These are clusters of similar incidents that are linked in some way, perhaps by offender, victim, or, crucially for our discussion, by place. They seek to understand the underlying conditions that give rise to these recurring problems.
So looking for the root cause of the pattern, not just dealing with each instance.
Exactly. It's a proactive, often bottom-up approach, where officers and analysts identify a specific problem, like repeated burglaries in one apartment complex, or persistent drug dealing on a particular corner. They then analyze its root causes, using environmental criminology insights about place, opportunity, lack of guardianship, etc., devise tailored responses, which might not just involve arrests, and then evaluate whether the response actually worked to solve or reduce the problem. This often involves looking beyond just enforcement. It requires police to partner with other agencies, social services, housing authorities, schools, community groups, even private businesses, to tackle the underlying conditions creating the problem in that specific location.
That sounds like a much more collaborative and strategic approach to dealing with environmental problems than simply arresting people for minor offenses. It's about fixing the place, not just removing the people temporarily.
It is, generally speaking. It integrates that environmental understanding of crime concentration with a more systemic, multi-agency approach to addressing the vulnerabilities of specific places to particular types of problems, rather than just focusing solely on offender behavior or simple enforcement tactics.
Okay. Now, building on these ideas of environmental vulnerability and opportunity, the source also mentions concepts like design against crime and focusing on hot products. These seem like even more specific applications.
Absolutely. These are more recent, very direct applications of the environmental and situational crime prevention principles we've been discussing. Design Against Crime, or DAC, emerged, for example, from work at the University of the Arts London, explicitly linking design practice with crime prevention theory. Its aims are very clear. First, to reduce crime through intentional design, whether that's the design of products, services, communications, or environments. Second, to equip designers with the knowledge and tools to actually design out criminal opportunities. Third, to promote the benefits of thinking about crime prevention early in the design process, not just as an afterthought. And fourth, to address the ways in which the environment itself, including products, can unintentionally facilitate crime. Its theoretical basis lies squarely in situational crime prevention and opportunity theory, the idea that crime often results from opportunities, and opportunities are frequently embedded in the design of objects, places, and processes.
So, literally thinking about crime prevention right from the drawing board when creating something new.
Exactly. Making it harder, or less rewarding, to commit crime through intelligent design from the outset. This connects very closely to the hot products theory, which was significantly articulated by Ronald Clark in 1999. His argument is that focusing research and policy attention on the specific items most likely to be stolen, the hot products, can be a highly effective crime prevention strategy because certain items are consistently targeted across different types of theft.
What makes a product hot beyond just being valuable? You mentioned craved earlier.
Right, Clark and others developed the CRAVED acronym. Hot products tend to be concealable, removable, available, valuable, enjoyable, and disposable, meaning easy to sell on. But beyond that general framework, his review showed specific patterns for different crime types. The ultimate hot product driving many thefts, of course, is cash. But for residential burglary, the text highlights items like jewelry, videos, this was 1999, remember, cash if kept at home, stereos, and televisions as consistently targeted. For shoplifting, the items vary by store, but often include things like cigarettes, alcohol, high-value fashion items like designer labels, and small, portable electronics or beauty products.
Things easy to grab and hide and worth something.
Exactly. For car theft, the hot cars depend on the motivation. Maybe sporty models for joyriding, expensive models for resale, sometimes overseas, or even older models where specific parts are in high demand for repairs. He even mentions commercial vehicles like construction tippers being identified as hot products, likely due to a relatively easy market for secondhand sales or parts.
It really underlines the point that offenders are often quite strategic, or at least patterned, in their target selection, right down to the specific item they're going after.
Yes, they are responding to the suitability of the target, as shaped by its design, portability, value, and how easy it is to dispose of. A key conclusion from Clark's review was that a relatively small number of these hot products account for a surprisingly large proportion of all thefts. He gives a really powerful statistic. Theft insurance claims for new cars in the USA were 20 times higher for the car models with the worst theft record compared to those models with the best record.
20 times higher, wow.
Yeah. This dramatically illustrates how focusing on the design or security of a specific type of product can have a huge impact on overall crime figures for that category.
That makes perfect sense. If you know thieves are disproportionately going after specific items, protecting those specific items is a direct route to reducing that type of theft. What are the broader implications of this hot products approach then?
Well, the implications are quite wide-ranging. First, it helps businesses understand what inventory is most at risk and how best to protect it. For example, better locks, tags, surveillance. It helps police provide much more targeted crime prevention advice to businesses and the public. It can help governments work proactively with industries, say, car manufacturers or electronics companies, to encourage them to design new products with improved security features before they hit the market and potentially become popular targets for theft, hopefully preventing future crime waves. It helps consumers understand the risks associated with owning or leaving certain items unsecured, but it assists police in thinking strategically about how to disrupt the markets for stolen goods, which are often organized around these specific hot products.
Tackling the demand side too.
Oh, exactly. Clark's final point, which you mentioned, is quite profound. He argues that large quantities of unprotected, attractive property don't just make life easier for existing habitual thieves, they also actively tempt new people, maybe young people or those facing hardship, into trying theft because the opportunity seems so easy and the risk low. So, making theft harder through better design and security, he suggests, isn't just about deterring existing criminals. It can contribute to a more orderly, less crime-prone society overall by reducing the sheer availability of easy opportunities that might draw new people in.
That really ties the entire environmental perspective together nicely, doesn't it? The availability of opportunities in the environment, whether it's the layout of a street, the lack of guardianship, or the design of a product, is presented as a fundamental driver of crime patterns.
It does. It shifts the focus, or at least balances the focus, from solely looking at the offender's background or pathology to understanding the crucial interaction between motivated offenders and the opportunities presented by the immediate environment. So as we bring this deep dive into environmental criminology towards a close, it's probably worth just remembering the array of thinkers and the research we've touched upon, from the early statistical maps of Gary and Quetelet through Mayhew's descriptions of rookeries and the Chicago school zones to the integrated British approaches of Morris, Rex, and Moore and Lambert. And then finally to the contemporary theories like routine activities, rational choice, crime pattern theory, defensible space, broken windows, design against crime, and hot products championed by figures like the Branninghams, Jacobs, Newman, Jeffrey, Filson, Wilson and Kelling, Matthews, Clark, and Hopkins Burke himself, synthesizing much of this. These names and their texts, they really represent a rich vein of knowledge for anyone wanting to explore further how place and environment shape crime.
It's definitely clear from this deep dive that environmental criminology, in its various forms, offers a powerful alternative, or perhaps more accurately, a complementary lens on crime. It moves us away from focusing purely on the internal characteristics or the deep social causes driving the offender, and puts the spotlight firmly on the criminal event itself and the environment in which it occurs. It tells us that crime isn't just about who someone is, but critically about the setting, the place, the target, the absence of guardians, the layout of the street, the design of the building, the vulnerability of the object being stolen.
Exactly. It really brings together insights from disparate fields, geography, sociology, architecture, urban planning, psychology, to understand the criminal act not in isolation, but as something intrinsically linked to its spatial and temporal context. It's about the chemistry, if you like, that happens when a motivated offender encounters a suitable target in a particular environment that lacks sufficient guardianship or control.
And it really underscores how seemingly subtle details about our built world or our daily routines or even the design of the products we own can inadvertently create or conversely remove opportunities for crime. It makes crime seem, in many ways, more predictable and therefore potentially more preventable by manipulating the environment rather than trying to change deep-seated individual motivations, which is often much harder.
And that's perhaps the most powerful implication, isn't it? If crime is patterned, if it's opportunity-driven in many cases, then intentional environmental design, environmental management, and situational prevention strategies have the potential to significantly disrupt those patterns and reduce crime by removing or reducing the opportunities in the first place.
This exploration of environmental criminology, from its earliest recognition of geographical patterns right through to modern hotspot analysis and design-based prevention, it really gives us a profound insight into the predictable nature of crime and the potential for proactive intervention through understanding place.
It definitely leaves us with a compelling question to consider in our own communities and cities. How do we create places that are not only functional, vibrant, and accessible for everyone, but also inherently resistant to criminal exploitation? How do we strike that difficult balance between openness and security, and between collective use and localized control? It's not always easy.
So thinking about all this, what stands out to you from this deep dive? As you maybe move through your day tomorrow, do you start to see the nodes and pathways you travel, the edges you cross or avoid, the potential targets around you, the guardians or lack thereof, or those subtle signs of care and neglect in the environments you inhabit? It certainly gives you a new way to look at the world around you.